As dawn broke over the drought-scorched frontier town, the trembling black girl stood defiant in the hotel doorway, her mangled hand pressed against her apron, declaring through gritted teeth to the weathered rancher, "They broke my hand, sir, but I'll keep cooking." The giant cowboy paused mid-step, shocked not just by her crushed fingers, but by the steel in her voice. The entire town whispered about the cook girl, dismissed as worthless now that 3 miners had accidentally crushed her dominant hand for refusing their advances. Most assumed she'd starve or disappear like all broken things in this unforgiving place. But the lonely cattle rancher, haunted by his own losses to the corrupt mining company, saw something different in her defiance. Hidden beneath the girl's humble circumstances lay a legal claim that could either save the dying town or destroy everyone who dared support her. Would her unbreakable spirit survive long enough to uncover the inheritance that powerful men would kill to keep buried? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, where dust devils danced between weathered buildings like ghosts of better times. The Grand Mesa Hotel stood as the town's beating heart, its kitchen windows glowing with warm light against the harsh desert landscape. Ayanna Johnson moved through the hotel kitchen with practiced grace, her dark hands working magic with simple ingredients. Steam rose from bubbling pots while the aroma of fresh bread filled the air. She had earned respect through her grandmother's recipes and her own innovations, turning basic supplies into meals that made grown miners weep with homesickness. The town itself bore the scars of corporate greed. The Consolidated Mining Company had stripped the land bare, leaving behind poisoned streams and desperate people. Wells ran dry while company executives lived in luxury. Workers scraped by on meager wages, their hope as parched as the cracked earth beneath their feet. 3 miles outside town, Silas Morgan sat on his porch, watching his cattle gather around the last muddy waterhole on his property. His weathered face told the story of a man who had lost everything that mattered. 3 years ago, his wife Sarah and young daughter Beth had died from drinking contaminated water, victims of mining runoff that the company claimed was safe. The isolation had become his refuge and his prison. Neighbors still offered condolences, but Silas found no comfort in their words. His ranch struggled without proper water sources, and each passing day brought him closer to losing the land his family had called home. Back at the hotel, trouble arrived in the form of 3 miners fresh from their shift. Jake Morrison led the group, his clothes reeking of sulfur and whiskey. They stumbled into the dining room, their voices loud and demanding. Morrison approached the kitchen window where Ayanna worked. His companions snickered behind him like schoolboys planning mischief. The other diners fell silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Ayanna continued kneading dough, refusing to acknowledge their presence. She had learned that ignoring such men often made them lose interest and move on to easier targets. Morrison leaned against the window frame. His breath carried the sour smell of cheap alcohol mixed with tobacco juice. He made crude comments about her appearance, each word designed to humiliate and degrade. Ayanna's hands never stopped working the dough. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity came from within, not from the opinions of lesser men. She shaped the bread with steady movements, her silence speaking louder than any retort. The rejection infuriated Morrison. He pushed away from the window and circled toward the kitchen door, his friends following like loyal dogs. Other diners looked away, unwilling to intervene in what seemed like inevitable trouble. Morrison burst through the kitchen door with his companions close behind. They cornered Ayanna near the large preparation table, blocking her escape routes. The kitchen suddenly felt cramped and threatening. Ayanna backed toward the heavy door that led to the pantry, her eyes scanning for anything she could use to defend herself. Her heart pounded, but her expression remained calm. Fear was a luxury she could not afford to show. Morrison reached for her arm, but Ayanna dodged away. She moved toward the back exit, but one of his friends cut off her path. They were playing with her now, enjoying her growing desperation. The confrontation escalated when Morrison grabbed at her apron strings. Ayanna pushed his hands away, her patience finally exhausted. She told them firmly to leave her kitchen and let her work in peace. Morrison's face twisted with rage at being rejected by someone he considered beneath him. He shoved Ayanna backward, and she stumbled against the pantry door. The heavy wooden barrier swung open under her weight. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Morrison lunged forward, either to grab her or push her further. Ayanna tried to step aside, but her foot caught on the door's metal threshold. She fell sideways, her right hand instinctively reaching out to break her fall. The pantry door, weighted with iron hinges and thick oak planks, swung back with tremendous force. Ayanna's dominant hand was caught directly in its path. The impact sounded like breaking kindling, followed immediately by her sharp cry of pain. Morrison and his friends froze, suddenly realizing their harassment had gone too far. They scrambled to appear innocent as footsteps approached from the dining room. Hotel owner Mr. Whitmore arrived to find Ayanna cradling her mangled hand against her chest. Whitmore surveyed the scene with cold calculation. 3 white miners stood looking sheepish while his black cook writhed in obvious agony. The mathematics of frontier justice were simple and brutal. Silas Morgan had chosen that moment to visit the hotel, hoping to arrange credit for supplies. He arrived just as Whitmore began questioning what had happened. The miners claimed it was an accident, that the girl had been clumsy and careless. Ayanna struggled to stand, her injured hand already swelling to twice its normal size. Bone fragments shifted visibly beneath the skin, and her fingers hung at unnatural angles. The pain was excruciating, but she refused to collapse in front of her tormentors. Whitmore shook his head in disgust, already calculating the cost of training a replacement cook. He told Ayanna she was clearly too injured to continue working, that damaged goods had no place in his establishment. Despite the agony coursing through her arm, Ayanna straightened her shoulders and looked Whitmore directly in the eyes. Her voice carried steady determination that surprised everyone present, including herself. She declared with quiet strength that they had broken her hand, but she would keep cooking regardless. Silas Morgan stood transfixed by her words, recognizing something in her defiance that reminded him of his own wife's courage. The broken girl had just shown more backbone than most men in town possessed. Whitmore dismissed Ayanna without ceremony, his decision final and cold. She gathered her few belongings while fighting waves of nausea from the pain. The other kitchen staff avoided eye contact, already distancing themselves from her misfortune. Silas watched the cruel efficiency of frontier economics play out before him. One moment of violence had stripped away her livelihood, her shelter, and her future. The miners who caused the damage walked away without consequence while she bore all the cost. 3 days later, Ayanna had taken refuge in a lean-to behind the Methodist church. Pastor Williams had offered what little help he could, but his congregation barely had enough to support their own families. Her hand had swollen into a grotesque mass of purple and black, the fingers useless and bent. The town's only doctor, Samuel Hayes, had refused to treat her properly. He claimed his services were reserved for paying customers, though everyone knew his real reason. Instead, she wrapped her hand in strips of cloth and tried to ignore the constant throbbing. Emma Carlyle arrived in Copper Ridge on the Tuesday stagecoach, her leather satchel filled with notebooks and determination. The young journalist from Philadelphia had come west to document frontier life for her newspaper's readers. She rented a small room above the general store and began exploring the town's history. Emma spent her mornings interviewing residents and her afternoons researching in the Territorial Land Office. The clerk, a nervous man named Peterson, seemed eager to help the educated woman from back east. He provided access to filing cabinets full of homestead records and military service documents. On her 4th day in town, Emma discovered something remarkable buried in the territorial files. A homestead application dated 15 years earlier bore the name Marcus Johnson, Buffalo Soldier, 10th Cavalry Regiment. The filing claimed 160 acres of prime land just east of town, including water rights to a natural spring. Emma cross-referenced the military records and found Marcus Johnson's service history. He had completed his required years of service and filed his claim according to territorial law. The land description matched property currently occupied by Consolidated Mining Company equipment and storage facilities. The journalist's instincts told her this discovery meant something important. She asked Peterson about the current status of the Johnson claim. The clerk shuffled through more files and confirmed that no subsequent sale or transfer had ever been recorded. Emma spent the evening walking through town, observing the social dynamics that govern daily life. She noticed how certain people were ignored or dismissed, how economic desperation created cruel hierarchies. Near the church, she encountered a young black woman struggling to start a fire with only her left hand. The woman's right hand was wrapped in dirty bandages and held useless against her body. Emma introduced herself and learned this was Ayanna Johnson, recently dismissed from the hotel kitchen. The surname immediately caught the journalist's attention. Emma asked carefully about Ayanna's family history. The conversation revealed that Ayanna's father had been a Buffalo soldier who died when she was young. Her mother had passed away 2 years later, leaving Ayanna to be raised by her grandmother in a neighboring territory. The pieces fell into place with startling clarity. Emma returned to her room and retrieved the homestead documents. She spread them across her small table and studied every detail. Marcus Johnson had never sold his land claim. According to territorial law, his legal heir would inherit the property and all associated rights. Emma found Ayanna the next morning and shared her discovery. The young woman listened in stunned silence as the journalist explained the legal implications. Her father, whom she remembered only as a kind man who told stories about his cavalry days, had left her a fortune she never knew existed. The land included the most reliable water source in the region. During the current drought, that spring had become invaluable beyond measure. Cattle ranchers, farmers, and the town itself all depended on water, and Ayanna legally owned the best source for miles around. Word of the discovery spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Emma's discreet inquiries had not gone unnoticed, and Peterson's loose tongue ensured that half the town knew about the Johnson land claim by evening. The revelation transformed how people viewed the injured young woman practically overnight. Silas Morgan heard the news while purchasing supplies at the general store. The storekeeper's wife whispered the story with obvious excitement, relishing the dramatic reversal of fortune. Silas felt a mixture of amazement and concern for what this would mean for Ayanna's safety. Consolidated Mining Company foreman Jacob Steele received word of the land claim within hours. He immediately dispatched riders to the territorial capital with instructions to research the legal standing of the Johnson filing. The company had invested heavily in their current operations and would not surrender valuable land without a fight. Dr. Hayes suddenly appeared at Ayanna's makeshift shelter that evening, carrying his medical bag and wearing an apologetic expression. He offered to examine her injured hand and provide proper treatment. His change of heart coincided perfectly with news of her potential wealth. Ayanna accepted the medical attention while recognizing the transparent motivation behind it. Hayes cleaned the wounds properly and set the broken bones as best he could, though permanent damage had already occurred. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and promised to check on her recovery. Threats began almost immediately. Anonymous notes appeared warning Ayanna to leave town quickly. Strangers watched her movements and followed her on errands. The mining company's influence reached into every corner of Copper Ridge, and their displeasure was becoming dangerously obvious. Silas approached Ayanna 3 days after Emma's revelation. He found her attempting to prepare a simple meal using only her left hand, her movements awkward but determined. The rancher had made his decision after watching the town's powerful interests begin to circle like vultures. He offered his protection and assistance in navigating the legal system. His own battles with Consolidated Mining had taught him about territorial law and corrupt officials. More importantly, his cattle desperately needed access to reliable water, and her spring could save his ranch from bankruptcy. Ayanna studied the weathered rancher's face and recognized genuine sincerity. She had learned to read people carefully, and Silas Morgan carried himself like a man who understood loss and injustice. His offer of partnership made strategic sense for both of them. The alliance formed quietly, but with mutual understanding of the stakes involved. Ayana stared at her bandaged hand for long minutes before accepting the challenge her circumstances demanded. The bones had healed crooked despite Dr. Hayes's late intervention, leaving her dominant hand weak and clumsy. Most people would have surrendered to defeat, but her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory with lessons about adaptation and survival. Her grandmother had lost her left arm in a cotton gin accident decades earlier, yet had continued cooking with innovations born from necessity. She had taught Ayana that true skill came from understanding ingredients and techniques, not from having perfect hands. Those lessons, dismissed as old woman stories, suddenly became lifelines. Ayana began experimenting in the church kitchen during quiet afternoon hours. She developed new ways to hold knives, using her body weight and gravity to assist her weakened grip. Chopping became a rhythmic dance of positioning and timing rather than brute force and speed. Pastor Williams donated flour and basic ingredients, curious about her determination to continue cooking despite obvious limitations. He watched her work with growing amazement as she created modified tools and techniques that actually improved some traditional recipes. The one-handed kneading method she developed produced bread with better texture than her previous attempts. The limitation forced her to work the dough more gradually, allowing gluten to develop naturally. Her biscuits emerged lighter and fluffier than anything the hotel's replacement cook could produce. Word spread through the community's hidden networks. Former hotel customers began appearing at the church, drawn by aromas that reminded them of better meals and happier times. Ayana served small portions from her experimental batches, building a following that surprised everyone, including herself. Silas proved invaluable in navigating the territorial legal system. His own battles with consolidated mining had taught him about corrupt judges, fraudulent contracts, and the importance of proper documentation. He spent hours teaching Ayana about property law and military service benefits. The rancher's expertise stemmed from painful experience. After his family's death, he had sued the mining company for damages, learning firsthand how corporate money influenced territorial courts. Though he had lost that case, the knowledge gained now served Ayana's cause. They gathered evidence methodically, building an ironclad case for her inheritance. Emma contributed research skills and connections to territorial officials who remained honest. Dr. Hayes provided medical testimony about the mining company's environmental damage, motivated by guilt over his initial treatment of Ayana. The spring on Ayana's land became the focal point of everyone's attention. Silas took her to see the property, riding carefully to avoid mining company patrols. The natural water source bubbled clear and cold from underground chambers, untouched by industrial contamination that poisoned other streams. Standing beside the spring, Ayana felt her father's presence for the first time since childhood. Marcus Johnson had chosen this land with soldier's instincts, recognizing the strategic value of clean water in an arid territory. His daughter now understood the precious gift he had left behind. Mining company intimidation escalated as their legal position weakened. Jacob Steele dispatched men to follow Ayana and document her activities. They lurked outside the church during her cooking sessions, making their presence obvious and threatening. Anonymous letters appeared with increasing frequency, warning her to abandon her land claim and leave town. The messages grew more specific and menacing, describing exactly how accidents could befall troublemakers who interfered with business interests. Silas began sleeping in the church basement, positioning himself between Ayana and potential threats. His presence deterred direct confrontation, but the psychological pressure continued mounting. Every shadow could hide danger. Every stranger might bring violence. Emma's journalistic investigation uncovered disturbing patterns in Consolidated Mining's operations. The company had systematically destroyed water sources throughout the territory, forcing communities into dependence on their controlled wells. Ayana's spring represented the last independent water source for miles around. The journalist discovered records of similar intimidation campaigns against other property owners. Families had been driven away through threats, legal harassment, and mysterious accidents. Those who resisted found their wells poisoned, their livestock sickened, their children threatened. Dr. Hayes provided crucial testimony about environmental damage caused by mining operations. His medical records documented increased illness and death rates correlating with company expansion. Silas's family had been among dozens of victims whose suffering was dismissed as natural causes. The evidence painted a picture of corporate conspiracy, extending far beyond simple land grabbing. Consolidated mining had systematically destroyed the region's ecosystem to maintain control over desperate communities. Government officials had been bought, judges corrupted, and honest voices silenced. Ayana's cooking became a symbol of resistance for the growing opposition movement. Her meals brought together unlikely allies, creating spaces where people could speak freely about their grievances. The church basement transformed into an informal headquarters for those demanding justice. Her one-handed techniques inspired others facing their own limitations and defeats. If a broken young woman could adapt and thrive, perhaps the whole community could find ways to fight back against seemingly impossible odds. Her quiet determination became contagious. Mayor Thompson found himself caught between competing pressures. Corporate money had funded his campaigns, but public opinion was shifting toward Ayana's cause. His political survival depended on choosing the winning side, though predicting the outcome remained difficult. The territorial court date approached like an approaching storm. Both sides gathered evidence, prepared witnesses, and marshaled their arguments. The hearing would determine not just Ayana's inheritance, but the future of an entire region held captive by corporate greed. Consolidated Mining deployed teams of lawyers from Denver, confident that legal expertise and financial resources would overcome any challenge. They underestimated the power of truth supported by meticulous documentation and community solidarity. Ayana spent the final weeks practicing her testimony, her scarred hand steady as she signed legal documents. The frightened girl who had once hidden in hotel kitchens had transformed into a determined woman ready to claim her birthright. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape Copper Ridge forever. Emma's investigation into Consolidated Mining's environmental practices began yielding disturbing results. Late nights spent reviewing company reports revealed glaring inconsistencies between public statements and internal documents. The journalist's trained eye caught discrepancies that exposed a pattern of deliberate deception. The mining company's official reports claimed their operations posed no threat to local water sources. Internal correspondence told a different story entirely. Memos discussed acceptable contamination levels and strategies for managing public relations when communities complained about poisoned wells. Emma discovered that Consolidated Mining had systematically identified and targeted independent water sources throughout the territory. Their expansion plans specifically mentioned the need to control all reliable springs and aquifers. Ayana's inheritance stood as the final obstacle to complete regional domination. The most damaging evidence came from a locked filing cabinet in Peterson's office. Emma's charm and persistence convinced the nervous clerk to grant her access to restricted territorial documents. Hidden among routine paperwork, she found mining company communications that revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. The documents outlined a comprehensive plan to drive down property values through environmental destruction. Once communities became desperate enough, Consolidated Mining would purchase entire towns at rock-bottom prices. The strategy had succeeded in 12 other territories across the West. Silas studied the evidence with growing anger and recognition. The timeline perfectly matched his family's illness and death. Sarah and Beth had not been random victims of industrial accident. They had been sacrificed on the altar of corporate profit, their lives deemed acceptable losses in a larger scheme. The rancher's personal tragedy suddenly took on new meaning. His wife's final days of agony, his daughter's small body racked with fever, his own helpless rage at their suffering. Every moment of grief had been orchestrated by men in distant offices who calculated human misery in terms of quarterly profits. Emma's research revealed that the poisoning had been methodical and precise. Company chemists had developed contamination methods that mimicked natural mineral imbalances. Victims appeared to die from environmental factors rather than industrial sabotage, making legal action nearly impossible. Dr. Hayes provided medical corroboration for Emma's findings. His patient records documented suspicious patterns of illness corresponding exactly with mining company operations. Families living near company facilities suffered kidney failure, birth defects, and mysterious wasting diseases at rates far exceeding normal statistics. The doctor had suspected corporate involvement for years, but lacked proof to support his theories. Emma's documentary evidence validated his worst fears about the systematic poisoning of entire communities. His guilt over staying silent intensified as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Ayanna absorbed the revelations with a mixture of horror and determination. Her land claim had evolved from personal inheritance to community salvation. The spring her father had secured represented not just wealth, but the last hope for regional independence from corporate tyranny. The evidence transformed the legal battle from property dispute to criminal prosecution. Emma prepared detailed reports documenting fraud, environmental destruction, conspiracy, and multiple counts of negligent homicide. Her journalistic credentials lent credibility to accusations that might otherwise be dismissed as frontier paranoia. Consolidated Mining's response escalated proportionally to the threat they now faced. Jacob Steele received orders from corporate headquarters to resolve the Johnson problem through any means necessary. The company's investment in regional operations totaled millions of dollars, making retreat financially impossible. Anonymous threats against Ayanna became more specific and menacing. Messages described her daily routines with disturbing accuracy, proving that watchers monitored her every movement. The psychological warfare intensified as the court date approached, designed to break her nerve before legal proceedings began. Emma faced similar intimidation tactics as her investigation deepened. Strangers followed her through town, asking pointed questions about her research and warning about the dangers facing nosy journalists. Her room was searched while she attended church services, though nothing was taken. Mayor Thompson found himself trapped between irreconcilable forces. Corporate money had funded his political career, but public opinion was shifting dramatically toward Ayanna's cause. His survival instincts warred with his financial obligations, creating internal conflict that affected his decision-making. The territorial court hearing represented a crossroads for everyone involved. Judge Harrison arrived from the capital with a reputation for fairness, though rumors suggested mining company attempts to influence his decisions. The outcome would determine whether law or money held ultimate power in the territory. Silas spent sleepless nights preparing testimony that would expose the company's crimes while honoring his family's memory. His personal loss gave weight to clinical evidence, transforming abstract environmental damage into human tragedy that demanded justice. Ayanna's supporters organized carefully for the hearing. Understanding that community presence could influence judicial decisions, Pastor Williams coordinated transportation for families willing to testify about mining company abuses. Their collective voice would speak for victims who could no longer defend themselves. Emma compiled her evidence into a comprehensive presentation that read like an indictment of corporate America's worst impulses. Her documentation traced the conspiracy from boardroom decisions to graveside consequences, connecting distant executives to local suffering through an unbreakable chain of evidence. The night before the hearing, Ayanna stood beside her father's spring under a canopy of desert stars. The water bubbled with the same purity that had attracted Marcus Johnson decades earlier, untouched by the corruption that surrounded it. Tomorrow would determine whether that purity could survive the forces arrayed against it. Dr. Hayes reviewed his medical testimony one final time, knowing that his credibility as the town's only physician could tip the balance toward justice. Years of silence about suspected corporate crimes weighed heavily on his conscience, making redemption through honest testimony feel like personal salvation. The stage was set for a legal confrontation that would expose the true cost of unrestrained corporate power in the American West. Judge Harrison arrived in Copper Ridge on the morning stage, his black robes and formal bearing commanding immediate respect. The territorial courthouse, normally used for minor disputes and claim jumpers, had been transformed for proceedings that would determine the region's future. Citizens packed every available seat while others crowded outside the windows. Ayanna entered the courthouse wearing her best dress, her scarred hand visible despite attempts to conceal it with gloves. The injury served as a constant reminder of how this legal battle had begun, transforming personal tragedy into a quest for community justice. Consolidated Mining's legal team occupied an entire table, their expensive suits and leather briefcases projecting corporate confidence. Lead attorney Bradford Winters had traveled from Denver specifically for this case. bringing the full weight of Eastern legal expertise to bear on what he considered a frontier nuisance. Emma sat in the front row with her notebooks ready, determined to document every moment of the proceedings. Her articles about the case had already generated interest in territorial newspapers, making this hearing a matter of regional significance beyond its immediate participants. Judge Harrison called the court to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. The proceedings began with Winters challenging the very foundation of Ayanna's claim, arguing that military homestead applications contained technical deficiencies that invalidated the entire filing. Emma's attorney, Samuel Richardson, countered with meticulous documentation proving Marcus Johnson had followed every territorial requirement. Military service records, witness statements, and filing receipts created an unassailable paper trail establishing legal ownership of the disputed land. The first day focused entirely on property law and bureaucratic procedures. Winters attacked each document with practiced skill, seeking any technical flaw that might undermine Ayanna's inheritance. Richardson defended with patient thoroughness, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Ayanna watched the legal maneuvering with growing confidence. Her father's military discipline had ensured proper completion of all required paperwork. Every document bore official stamps and signatures that validated his claim under territorial homestead laws. The second day brought personal testimony that transformed abstract legal arguments into human drama. Silas took the stand first, his weathered face grave as he described his family's final days, Sarah's gradual weakening, Beth's fevered nightmares, his own helpless vigil beside their deathbeds. Dr. Hayes followed with medical testimony that connected individual tragedies to broader patterns of environmental poisoning. His patient records documented dozens of similar cases, all concentrated near mining company operations. The statistical correlation was undeniable and damning. Emma presented her investigative findings with journalistic precision, reading directly from company documents that revealed the scope of Consolidated Mining's conspiracy. Internal memos discussing acceptable contamination levels and strategies for acquiring properties through environmental manipulation painted a picture of calculated malice. The courtroom erupted when Emma read a memo describing Silas's family as acceptable losses in the larger acquisition strategy. Judge Harrison restored order with difficulty, his own composure visibly shaken by the callousness of the revealed communications. Winters attempted to discredit Emma's evidence by questioning her methods of acquisition, but Peterson the clerk confirmed under oath that all documents had been properly accessed through official channels. The mining company's own words condemned them more effectively than any outside accusations. Community members testified throughout the third day, describing years of intimidation, environmental destruction, and economic manipulation. Families shared stories of poisoned wells, sickened livestock, and mysterious illnesses that coincided with mining operations. Mrs. Patterson described watching her vegetable garden wither after mining runoff contaminated her irrigation source. Tom Bradley testified about cattle deaths that followed the installation of company processing equipment upstream from his grazing land. Each story added weight to the mounting evidence of systematic environmental warfare. Mayor Thompson surprised everyone by testifying against the mining company. His political survival instincts had finally overcome his financial obligations, leading him to reveal details of bribes and intimidation tactics used to influence local government decisions. The mayor's testimony proved particularly damaging because it established a pattern of corruption extending beyond environmental crimes. Judge Harrison took careful notes as Thompson described pressure campaigns designed to silence opposition voices and suppress evidence of corporate wrongdoing. Winters's defense crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. His attempts to portray the contamination as natural environmental fluctuations failed when confronted with chemical analysis proving industrial sources. Company denials became impossible to maintain when faced with their own internal documents. The final day brought closing arguments that crystallized months of investigation and preparation. Richardson summarized the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case for both Ayanna's legal inheritance and the mining company's criminal conspiracy. Winters's closing argument focused on economic necessity and regional development, arguing that mining operations provided essential employment despite unfortunate side effects. His appeal to practical concerns rang hollow after days of testimony about corporate deception, and environmental destruction. Judge Harrison retired to consider his verdict while the courtroom buzzed with nervous anticipation. The decision would determine not just property ownership, but whether corporate power could override territorial law and human decency. 3 hours later, Harrison returned with a judgment that vindicated everything Ayanna and her supporters had endured. He validated her inheritance under territorial homestead law while simultaneously ordering criminal charges against Consolidated Mining executives for fraud, environmental destruction, and conspiracy. The mining company faced immediate shutdown of all regional operations pending environmental restoration. Corporate assets would be seized to fund cleanup efforts and provide compensation to affected families. Justice had finally arrived in Copper Ridge. Ayanna's scarred hand trembled as she signed the papers officially claiming her father's legacy. The frightened girl who had once hidden in hotel kitchens had become the legal owner of land that would reshape an entire region's future. 1 year after the court decision, Copper Ridge had transformed from a dying mining town into a thriving agricultural community. The poisoned streams ran clear again thanks to restoration efforts funded by Consolidated Mining's seized assets. Green fields stretched where industrial waste had once scarred the landscape. Ayanna stood at the edge of her cooperative farm, watching families work land that had seemed barren just months earlier. Her father's spring provided irrigation for crops that fed the entire region. The water that Marcus Johnson had secured through military homestead now sustained dozens of families rebuilding their lives. The cooperative operated on principles of shared labor and mutual benefit. Former miners had become farmers, learning sustainable techniques that replenished rather than depleted the soil. Women who had struggled to feed their families now tended gardens that produced surplus crops for regional markets. Silas managed the agricultural operations with enthusiasm that had replaced his years of bitter isolation. Teaching sustainable farming methods gave him purpose that honored his family's memory while building something positive from tragedy. His expertise in cattle ranching complemented Ayanna's innovations in food production and preservation. Dr. Hayes ran a medical clinic funded by the community's collective prosperity. His patient records now documented improving health outcomes as clean water and nutritious food replaced the contamination and malnutrition of the mining era. Childhood mortality rates dropped dramatically while general wellness flourished. Emma's articles about the Copper Ridge transformation had gained national attention, inspiring similar resistance movements in other territories dominated by exploitative corporations. Publishers competed for her stories about environmental restoration and community cooperation in the American West. The journalist had established a permanent residence in town, documenting the ongoing experiment in sustainable development. Her reports attracted visitors from universities and government agencies interested in replicating Copper Ridge's success in other damaged regions. Mayor Thompson had won re-election by overwhelming margins after his testimony helped convict mining company executives. His political courage during the trial transformed him from a compromised politician into a genuine leader committed to community welfare over corporate interests. The town council now included Ayanna as its youngest member, her scarred hand a visible reminder of the struggle that had brought them to prosperity. Her voice carried special weight in decisions about resource management and community development, earned through courage rather than inherited privilege. Pastor Williams's church had become the unofficial community center where major decisions were made through collective discussion rather than corporate decree. The basement where Ayanna had first demonstrated her one-handed cooking techniques now hosted planning meetings for regional agricultural initiatives. The Grand Mesa Hotel struggled under new management after Mr. Whitmore's business collapsed following the trial. Community members who had witnessed Ayanna's firing refused to patronize the establishment, preferring the cooperative's restaurant where former outcasts now served excellent meals to grateful customers. Jake Morrison and his companions faced legal consequences for their assault on Ayanna, serving jail sentences that reflected the community's changed priorities. Their release would find them in a town that no longer tolerated the casual violence that had once passed for entertainment. The natural spring had been designated a territorial landmark, with a stone marker commemorating Marcus Johnson's foresight and his daughter's courage. Visitors came from across the territory to see the water source that had become a symbol of resistance against corporate exploitation. Ayana's cooking had evolved into a teaching profession as she trained other women in food preservation and preparation techniques. Her adaptive methods, developed from necessity during her injury, proved superior to traditional approaches in the harsh frontier environment. The cooperative's restaurant operated from a building constructed specifically for community meals and celebrations. Ayana's scarred hand worked confidently alongside others, creating dishes that brought together people who had once been divided by artificial hierarchies of race and class. Territorial officials frequently visited Copper Ridge to study its transformation from environmental disaster to sustainable prosperity. Government reports cited the community as a model for post-industrial development that prioritized human welfare over extractive profits. The three miners who had broken Ayana's hand returned to find themselves unwelcome in the new Copper Ridge. Their former employer had abandoned them when criminal charges were filed, leaving them to face community justice without corporate protection. Emma documented their attempts at reconciliation in articles that explored themes of redemption and accountability. The community's response reflected mature judgment rather than vengeful satisfaction, offering opportunities for genuine reform while maintaining appropriate consequences. Environmental restoration continued under scientific supervision, with contaminated soil being gradually rehabilitated through innovative techniques developed by the cooperative's agricultural program. The poisoned legacy of industrial exploitation slowly gave way to fertile abundance. Dr. Hayes established a medical school that trained frontier physicians in both traditional healing and environmental health practices. Students came from across the territory to learn in a community that had successfully addressed the health consequences of industrial contamination. The Harvest Festival had become an annual celebration that attracted visitors from neighboring territories. Tables laden with food surrounded the memorial spring, creating a living testament to the transformation possible when communities unite against oppression. Ayana moved through the celebration with quiet satisfaction, her scarred hand steady as she served portions to guests from across the region. Children who had never known hunger played games beside the spring that sustained their community's prosperity. A visitor from Philadelphia asked about the prominent scar on her right hand, curious about its origin. Ayana paused in her work, considering how to summarize the journey that had brought them all to this moment of abundance and peace. She smiled and returned to her preparations, her response carrying the wisdom earned through struggle and victory. They had tried to break more than her hand, but some things simply refused to stay broken. The spring bubbled with eternal promise beside tables where former enemies now shared meals in celebration of their common humanity.